To unpack this issue for us a bit more further, we are now joined by Yolisa Piliso, who is a candidate attorney at Equal Education Law Centre, and he joins us via our Zoom link. Yolisa, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. Of course, this is something very serious in our country. It's nothing new, but why do we continue to see it as a major problem?
Thank you, Bali, and thanks for having me. I think, firstly, as you reiterated, that this is not the first time we see this issue happening. We've seen over the years, and between even like March 2021, April 2022, we've seen over 90,000 teenage pregnancies reported. But I think the focus should not necessarily, or must not only be on specific numbers, but we must also look at the serious implication that teenage pregnancies has on the right to basic education, and how learners that are pregnant are being discriminated and face stigma in schools. So as much as it may be seen as an issue that is related to schools, but it must also be borne in mind that this is not only an education issue, but also is a social issue that has impact throughout.
And, what seems to be the contributing factors here, where we continue to see young girls as young as 10 years old falling pregnant while they're still at school?
I think there are many contributing factors that have effects on teenage pregnancies. One cannot identify one as a particular thing, but I think there are certain issues that were correctly articulated around issues of statutory rape, because no one may have a sexual intercourse with a child that is below the age of 16 if that is an adult person. So it's many different parts that contribute to that. And I think the nature of children are generally vulnerable beings, and the contributing factors may also be the surroundings and the environment in which they are growing up into. Because if we may take a deep dive into looking into where exactly these children are located, we may find that you probably find them in previously disadvantaged communities, your rural communities, and as it's clear as it's shown in the Northern Cape, that is a particular area in which we're seeing ripe numbers of teenage pregnancies. So there are so many contributing factors around teenage pregnancies.
And when you look at the figures, Yolisa, in terms of teenage pregnancy, you speak of statutory rape. When you look at who is actually impregnating young girls, do you find that it's most of the time it's men who are much older, or do you also find that actually some of these teenage pregnancies are caused by their peers?
I think, Bali, it's both. It could be adults, it could be their peers that are perpetrators of statutory rape, certainly. And sometimes you may find that it's teachers that are also perpetrators in contribution to teenage pregnancies. Although we know certainly that there's certain statutory acts such as the Employment of Educators Act and South African Council for Educators Act ensures that these relationships are prohibited and no teachers are allowed to engage in sexual relationship with learners. So we still find that there are reported cases where there are children that are engaged in sexual relationship with adults, although these issues are prohibited by law.
And Yolisa, you also spoke about some of the contributing factors, and you're saying that most of these pregnancies also take place in impoverished areas, in rural communities. What role does poverty play when we see, a surge in the number of teenagers falling pregnant?
I think if you look at the numbers of teenage pregnancies over the years, and the tragic the numbers would direct you into specific communities where there's this large number of inequality and poverty. But I think it's something that the Department of Basic Education, as well as other departments, including the Department of Social Development, needs to also interrogate in terms of what could be the contributing factors around these issues. But what we could also highlight as an issue of pregnant teenagers, including particularly learners that funds themselves, is sometimes discriminated and excluded from schools. They are sometimes deprived of an opportunity to have a meal in school, where they may not be able to have food in their homes, because such programs such as the National School Nutrition Program are there to ensure that children do have access to food. But you will find that these learners are excluded in schools. But we know certainly that there is a learner pregnancy policy that was promulgated into law in 2022. At least it ensures that there is a protection around the learners that may find themselves in unintended pregnancies.
And Yolisa, I know that in the past, young girls would try and get contraceptives by going to a local hospital or local clinic, and usually they were always turned away, or shamed by some of the healthcare practitioners. Do you find that that's still prevalent, that maybe the cause of this is that, the contraceptives are not easily accessible to young girls?
Yeah, that's certainly correct, buddy. As I've highlighted, even though we know for sure that there are statutory provisions that ensure protection and of like, for example, statutory rape, but we see those things still happening. So I think the commonality in that is the norm, that we've seen, that the difficulty in accessing sexual reproductive health services for young girls is certainly a challenge. There's still a stigma around that, and I think also the Department of Basic Education also have a very bigger role to ensure that stigma around access to sexual and reproductive health services is not an issue, and to ensure that there is an emphasis on the comprehensive sexual education implemented in schools, also to ensure that they are permissible to have access to sexual and reproductive health services as well.
And Yolisa, one would ask young girls at home living in rural communities, what is the way forward? How do we prevent this, from taking place? How do we, try and bring down the numbers of teenage pregnancy in this country?
So, sure. As I've said, there is not necessarily a panacea to like dealing with this issue. It requires a holistic approach. It requires intersectoral approach that includes communities, that includes families and parental involvement as well. And it actually needs learners themselves to be able to be taught if they are receiving education in school, and be able to implement certain activities that they may be getting through life orientation classes, for example. And I think also the Department of Basic Education and Department of Social Development also has a direct role to play in ensuring that learners are encouraged not to engage in sexual activities, and to be taught about the repercussions around what would be the effects of themselves getting into such. But we're certainly aware that the learner pregnancy policy is in place to ensure that those objectives are achieved, and we are hopeful that because over the years we didn't have the learner pregnancy policy in terms of to ensure that these challenges are eradicated.
All
we are
right.
hoping at least now that the policy is in effect, maybe the DBE will have some positive outcomes out of that.
All right, Yolisa Piliso, thank you so much for your time. That is Yolisa Piliso. He is a candidate attorney at Equal Education, the Law Center. Of course, speaking to us about something very problematic in our society, that is teenage pregnancy.